You ever have one of those mornings where you step outside, expecting your yard to be peaceful, the grass smelling fresh, the flowers standing proud, and then your heart sinks? That was me last Thursday. I opened the back gate, looking forward to a quiet morning coffee, and instead I was met with a small lake. Not the pond I'd planted, not a puddle from a storm. It was water, everywhere, creeping across my lawn from my neighbor's property like it had a mind of its own. And of course, it wasn't an accident. This had been happening for weeks. Every rain, every storm, some of their runoff ended up on my property, soaking my grass, drowning my flower beds, and making my backyard feel more like a swamp than a retreat. For context, my name's Sam Reed. I live on a quiet suburban block just outside Crestwood. My backyard is my sanctuary, small garden, a few fruit trees, a patch of lawn I care about, and some flowers my grandmother helped me plant. It's nothing extravagant, but it's mine, and I tend it like a little oasis away from the chaos of everyday life. But my neighbor, let's call her HOA Karen, sees it differently. She doesn't respect boundaries, and she clearly thinks her water, her runoff, her convenience is more important than my property, my trees, my flowers, or the effort I've put into creating this small patch of peace. The first few times it happened, I tried the polite route. I knocked on her door, explained that the drainage from her yard was flooding mine. She smiled sweetly, one of those smiles that says she heard you, but won't actually listen. "Oh, Sam, it's just rainwater. You know how it is," she said. I nodded, trying not to let my frustration show, thinking maybe she didn't realize the impact. But the next week, the same thing happened. And then again the week after. Every small storm became a lesson in patience, or a test of it, and my patience was wearing thin. By the third incident, I started to realize that this wasn't going to stop unless I did something. I couldn't just sit back and watch my lawn, my plants, my backyard, my sanctuary, get repeatedly flooded because someone decided they could ignore property lines. I walked the yard that afternoon, soaking wet from water creeping in from the edges, and I felt that familiar mix of frustration and determination. There's a point where politeness ends and strategy begins, and I knew I had reached it. Over the next few days, I observed. I watched the slope of her property, the gutters, the drainage channels she'd set up. I noted the paths the water took, how it pooled near the corner of my garden, and where it tended to run fastest. And yes, I started to plan. Not revenge in a mean sense, not destruction, but a clever, strategic way to return the favor, using the water itself, but legally, subtly, and, I hoped, effectively. It was almost meditative. Mapping her flow, thinking through the logistics, imagining how a careful adjustment of my own property's drainage could send the water right back, gently, calmly, but unmistakably. Meanwhile, I had conversations with friends and family, just to test the sanity of my ideas. "You're not thinking of building a dam or something, right?" My brother laughed. I shook my head. Nothing illegal, nothing destructive. Just clever redirection. If she wants to treat my yard like a drainage ditch, she'll meet the consequences in the form of awareness. They laughed, but I could see they understood. Sometimes, subtlety is more satisfying than confrontation, and watching someone realize their entitlement has limits is far sweeter than yelling or escalating a fight. Friday came, and the yard looked deceptively peaceful. The rain from Thursday had dried a bit, and the flowers had perked up despite being soaked. I walked along the edges, imagining the next storm, imagining Karen's SUV pulling into her driveway, water flowing down her slope, and how that same water would now meet my subtle adjustments and return in ways that she couldn't ignore. My mental satisfaction grew with each step, each visualization, until I could almost hear the splash in her startled voice, though I knew I had to wait. Patience, observation, and careful planning were key. I began adjusting the small channels along my yard. Nothing destructive, nothing permanent. Just minor diversions, angled carefully, guiding the water subtly. I moved a few pavers, adjusted soil grading, and repositioned some stones along the garden edge. The work was quiet, precise, and strangely satisfying. Every adjustment was part of a larger plan, to send the water back, gently but undeniably, the next time it flowed onto my property. It was the perfect combination of creativity, patience, and subtle justice. And all the while, I reflected on the absurdity of it all. Here I was, spending hours planning for water that wasn't even mine, imagining scenarios that seemed almost cartoonish, yet entirely necessary. HOA Karen didn't realize she had created a problem she couldn't ignore, and I had the perfect opportunity to respond in a way that was thoughtful, clever, and entirely lawful. There's something deeply satisfying about using strategy over aggression, planning over yelling, and letting consequences, not confrontation, do the teaching. Saturday morning, the yard was calm again, the air crisp, the sun rising over the rooftops. I stood at the edge of the garden, coffee in hand, and watched the street. Everything looked ordinary, but I knew the storm was coming. Not the clouds, not the rain, but the moment when nature and strategy would combine to deliver a lesson in subtlety and boundaries. And I realized that this story, one that could have been frustrating, exhausting, and bitter, had become something else. It was about awareness, cleverness, and standing up for yourself in ways that don't escalate conflict but still assert control. By the time I finished my coffee, I had a clear plan. Channels set, stones in place, grading perfected, and mental scenarios rehearsed. The stage was ready. HOA Karen might still think she could treat my yard as a runoff pit, but the next storm would teach her differently. Not harshly, not destructively, just undeniably. And I felt a strange sense of satisfaction, knowing that sometimes patience, planning, and cleverness are far more effective than confrontation. The water would speak for me, and the lesson would land. That's where part one ends. The hook is set, the conflict established, and the stage prepared for the payback. The next storm would bring the high-stakes action of redirecting her water, the cinematic tension of her reaction, and the ultimate lesson in boundaries and respect. Saturday afternoon arrived, and the skies were clear, the sun casting long shadows across my backyard. The water channels I had carefully constructed gleaming subtly in the light. Everything looked normal, but I knew better. HOA Karen always had a routine. Every storm, every downpour, she somehow managed to let the runoff from her property flood my yard. And today, I was ready to make sure that her arrogance met consequences. Not dramatic, not destructive, but subtle, clever, and undeniable. I stood on the edge of the garden, sipping iced tea, watching the slight slope of my yard. The channels I had adjusted just enough to direct water flow with precision. It wasn't a dam, it wasn't a trap in the malicious sense. It was engineering and patience, a quiet but firm statement. Respect boundaries or learn the consequences. I imagined the scene perfectly in my head. A gentle storm, water trickling from her yard, entering my channels, being guided along subtle inclines and stones, and ending up right back near her foundation in a harmless but startling way. By mid-afternoon, the first clouds began to gather, a soft hint of rain in the distance. I felt a thrill of anticipation, like watching a chess match unfold, where every move had been planned and every outcome considered. Grandpa would have called it poetic justice. I grinned quietly at the thought. The storm would arrive, the water would flow, and I would watch, calm and collected, as nature and preparation combined to teach HOA Karen a lesson she couldn't ignore. And then, of course, she appeared, driving slowly down the street, sunglasses on, clipboard in hand, looking far too confident, far too sure that she was still the queen of her little suburban domain. Her friends followed in a second car, chatting casually, oblivious to the subtle engineering of consequences waiting for them. I stepped back, leaning against the fence, and let them roll in. The first trickle of water appeared almost theatrically, slipping from her slope, hesitant at first, moving predictably along the channels I had prepared. "Oh," I whispered under my breath, almost laughing quietly. I could see her forehead crease, just the slightest twitch of concern as the water began to follow paths she hadn't expected. She slowed, her hand tightening on the wheel, and I could hear her muttering to herself, frustrated but confused. "Why is this? What is going on?" Her friends leaned forward, trying to see what was happening, their smiles fading into uncertainty. The water began to flow more steadily, guided gently along the channels, diverted around the flower beds, pushed along low-lying paths, and subtly directed toward her yard in a way that was completely harmless but completely undeniable. She tried to adjust her slope, redirect runoff, but every time she did, the water simply found another path, following the lines I had engineered, polite but persistent. I leaned on the fence, sipping iced tea, marveling at the elegance of it. "Mia," My friend, who had come over to observe, whispered, "This is amazing. She has no clue what's happening." I nodded quietly, trying not to smile too widely. It was true. The water wasn't punishing her, wasn't destructive, but it was undeniable. She could no longer treat my yard like a drainage ditch without consequences. Every inch of flow reinforced a lesson I had long wanted to communicate: respect other people's property. As the rain grew heavier, the channels worked perfectly. Small streams diverted around my flower beds, flowed around shrubs, and finally pooled in a shallow, controlled section of her lawn. Nothing permanent, nothing dangerous, just the gentle reflection of her own actions returning to her in a way that couldn't be ignored. I could see the change in her face: confusion, irritation, disbelief. She muttered another string of words under her breath, clearly flustered. Her friends exchanged looks, realizing this was not a casual mishap. They had met consequences engineered with patience, subtlety, and precision. I could feel a strange satisfaction, but also a deeper reflection. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't malice. It was consequence. It was patience. It was the application of cleverness to enforce boundaries in a way that maintained dignity for everyone. And as I watched, I realized how often people ignore limits, testing others, assuming that entitlement grants them the freedom to act without consequence. This small suburban flood had become a perfect lesson in respect, patience, and subtle enforcement. By mid-afternoon, the water had fully returned, the flow complete, her yard gently reminded of its connection to mine. She tried to adjust again, scooping at small channels, gesturing, muttering, but each attempt only reinforced the lesson. Boundaries matter, respect is earned, and clever planning speaks louder than confrontation. I leaned on the fence, feeling a quiet triumph. Not just because I had redirected the water, but because I had done it with intelligence, patience, and subtlety, and I had maintained my own dignity throughout. And then, the best part, the cinematic high point, occurred. Her SUV rolled slowly into her driveway, the water following its path, creating a perfectly harmless but clearly noticeable flow along her yard's edge. She stopped, jaw tightening, staring at the subtle reflection of her own negligence. She waved her hand at her friends as if to say, "This isn't happening." But the flow was undeniable. The lesson was now visual, tangible, and unforgettable. Grandpa would have been proud. He always said, consequences are best taught quietly and cleverly. And as I watched, I could see the lesson unfold exactly as he would have hoped: subtle, harmless, but unforgettable. The water, a simple element of nature, had spoken the message: respect others' property or meet consequences you cannot ignore. And it was beautiful in its simplicity. By the evening, the rain stopped, the sun returned, and the yard settled back into quiet. HOA Karen and her friends left, muttering, subdued, but undeniably aware. They had learned something they couldn't ignore. And I realized, standing in my garden, that this lesson was deeper than water or property lines. It was about patience, observation, creativity, and the quiet power of enforcing boundaries with intelligence rather than anger. I walked through the yard, inspecting my flower beds, my shrubs, my trees, and the channels I had engineered. Everything was intact. Everything had served its purpose. The subtle flood had communicated a lesson that words could not. And as I leaned against the fence, sipping a fresh drink, I reflected on the absurdity and beauty of the situation. A small suburban water conflict had become a perfect demonstration of human behavior, ingenuity, and the importance of boundaries. The lesson was clear: entitlement and neglect have consequences, subtlety can teach more effectively than confrontation, and preparation pays off. The satisfaction wasn't just in the water redirected. It was in the calm, strategic victory, the quiet assertion of control, and the knowledge that I had maintained dignity, legality, and cleverness throughout. By nightfall, the yard was quiet again, calm and restored. HOA Karen would think twice next time, whether she admitted it or not. And I knew that the story wasn't just about water or flooding or a small suburban dispute. It was about strategy, respect, and the quiet enforcement of boundaries that everyone could understand without a single raised voice. By Sunday morning, the yard was finally quiet. The channels I had set, the subtle adjustments to the slopes, the small barriers that guided water precisely where it needed to go, they all had done their job. The grass had dried, the flower beds stood tall, and for the first time in weeks, I could take a deep breath without thinking about puddles or runoff from HOA Karen's property. Everything felt restored, not just the physical yard, but the sense of control and dignity that comes when you finally enforce your boundaries in a way that works. I walked along the edges of the yard, boots sinking lightly into the soft grass, sipping my morning coffee. The subtle diverts I had engineered were barely noticeable, yet they had communicated the message loud and clear: respect this property or learn through consequences. HOA Karen had experienced the results firsthand. Her arrogance, her sense of entitlement, had met something equally clever, patient, and perfectly lawful. I couldn't see her now, but I knew the lesson had landed. And I admit, it felt strangely satisfying. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't destruction. It was consequence. It was patience, observation, and planning applied perfectly to everyday life. And in that, I realized a deeper truth. Boundaries are rarely respected until they're enforced. And enforcement doesn't have to be loud, violent, or dramatic. It can be subtle, intelligent, and utterly undeniable. The water that had once invaded my yard had returned to teach a lesson, and I had orchestrated it. It was as much about strategy and patience as it was about the yard itself. Later that afternoon, I spotted HOA Karen walking slowly along the street. She looked cautious, hesitant even, surveying the slope of her yard as if expecting the water to act up again. Her friends were quieter than usual, glancing nervously at the edges of her property. I could see the subtle shift in their expressions: bewilderment, mild irritation, and perhaps the first sparks of respect. They had learned that repeated disregard has consequences, and that clever planning can communicate lessons more effectively than confrontation ever could. I couldn't help but smile quietly, not mockingly, not vindicatively, but with the kind of calm satisfaction that comes from executing a plan perfectly. The yard had spoken, and HOA Karen had listened without realizing it. I leaned on the fence, taking in the quiet of my backyard, the gentle sway of the trees, the neat lines of my flower beds, and the soft sunlight reflecting off the channel stones. Everything was as it should be, and it felt like a small victory, elegant in its simplicity. And yet, in that quiet, I reflected further. This wasn't just about water or flower beds or a small suburban dispute. It was about human behavior, entitlement, and respect. People often assume they can bypass rules or boundaries, thinking no one will notice. But consequences, even subtle ones, have a way of teaching lessons far better than yelling or escalating a conflict. I had applied observation, creativity, and strategy to enforce respect, and the results were immediate, undeniable, and completely satisfying without any hostility. By evening, as the sun dipped low over the rooftops, I sat on the porch, sipping iced tea, watching shadows stretch across the yard. The neighborhood had returned to its rhythm: distant traffic, dogs barking, kids laughing in the distance. But my yard felt different. It was more than grass, soil, and flowers. It was a statement, a quiet assertion that boundaries matter, that property has respect inherent to it, and that clever, thoughtful action can enforce those boundaries without conflict. And I realized something else. The lesson didn't just apply to HOA Karen. It applied to life. People test limits constantly, in neighborhoods, at work, in friendships. They assume that convenience or entitlement outweighs respect. And often, the way to correct that is not with confrontation or anger, but with thoughtful, intelligent, and deliberate action. That was the deeper satisfaction: seeing a principle play out in reality, in a way that was lawful, harmless, but undeniably effective. By the time night fell, everything had settled. The yard was quiet, the channels were dry, and my sanctuary was fully restored. I knew HOA Karen would think twice before letting her runoff flood my yard again, whether she admitted it or not. And I also knew that I had learned something important. Patience and strategy can be more powerful than anger, and subtle consequences teach lessons that words cannot. Now, I want to ask you, the viewer, what would you do if a neighbor kept sending floodwater into your yard? Would you confront them directly, try to reason politely, or respond with strategy like I did? Do you think my actions were clever and fair, or maybe a bit over the top? Have you ever had a situation where someone ignored boundaries, and how did you respond? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because respect, boundaries, and consequences are universal, and everyone has a story. Because at the end of the day, the water is gone, the yard is restored, and the message has been delivered quietly but unmistakably. HOA Karen learned, subtly but effectively, that my property is mine, and boundaries exist for a reason. And I've learned a little more about patience, cleverness, and the quiet power of enforcing respect without raising your voice. So tell me, what would you do if this happened to you? Let's talk about entitlement, property, and the clever ways to restore balance in our neighborhoods. Share your experiences, comment below, and let's see how people handle boundaries in their own lives.